Welcome to the Libido Lounge, where we focus on all things love, lust, and libido. We believe that fabulous sex is important to health as exercise and good food. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode on The Lounge. I'm your libido expert, Dr. Diane Mueller, and I'm so excited to invite Dr. Evelin Dacker to our show today. We're going to have a great conversation. I was really inspired to get Dr. Dacker on the phone with me today because of so many areas of her work, but in particular, her work around communication and how we talk about sex. She has a really great acronym and process for what she teaches about. We're going to get into that today. And a lot of the episode, we're going to see where this goes as always, but a lot of the orientation today is going to be on communication, on sex, on how do we talk to our partners, on how do we talk to each other about this very important topic. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here as well.
I'd love, before we jump into the juiciness of the story, I'd love to hear a little bit of the nuts and bolts of you from a standpoint of you've gone such an interesting direction as a doc in your career to really bring so much communication and so much of the conversation around healthy sexuality, and not just to focus on, say, the physical component of human sexuality. So I'm curious about your story, if we can lead with that, around like what really happened or what transpired to help you understand that this is such an important thing to talk about, and then to, take it pretty big and get on, TEDx and really be getting your word out. What was the initial, say process of that?
Oh, okay. It was roller derby.
For real or figurative?
No, really. Like, I joined a roller derby team when I was like 44. And all of a sudden, like, being in a group of women who were in this like place in their life of wanting to express themselves and like with avatars and dressing up and just like being in a community of women really made me realize how little we knew about sex, how little we know about our own sexuality, and how little it's talked about. So I was not a good roller derby player, but I was kind of like the team doc. And people just were asking me questions. And at the same time, I was in the process of getting a certification in functional medicine, which I kind of called naturopathy for MDs. And I realized, darn, I'm learning about all this root cause of illness and disease, but we're not talking about something that's so important, and that's pleasure.
Yeah.
Like, what pleasure, connection, what makes our life yummy, right? And that's kind of where I started going into sexuality, but not sexuality as like something is wrong, but like how can we actually make things great for ourselves? I was also 44, so I know, as being a doctor, I've been working with menopause and perimenopause for the last 20, 30 years. And I had this story in my head that, oh my God, I'm going to hit 50 and I'm going to be dead sexually, right? Because that's kind of the story that we're given. And I decided that didn't have to be true. And I went deep into like studying sexuality, but not from the lens of medicine and dysfunction, but from the lens of like, what are people actually doing? And so, I like to laugh. Like, I took up my first, people asked me, so how'd you get into this? Like, what continuing education did you do? And I'm like, oh, I took some classes at a sex store. And an adult store. There's a great store in Portland, Oregon called She Bop, and they used to teach classes. So I went and I started learning from people who were sex educators. And I realized that there's some really important things out there that is not known in the mainstream. And I just felt like the world could be so different, and the way we navigate sexuality could be so different if we take these lessons from these sex positive subcultures and actually bring them to the mainstream, which is kind of where my work is.
I love it. And definitely similar soul missions. I often say pleasure is not just about desire. It's something we require. And it's for exactly what you said. It's like so much, I think, of motivation in medicine and society is like away from pain, which is important. But I really appreciate what you're doing because it's like changing the orientation from moving away from pain to actually, like you said, like making life more yummy, right? Bringing in more of that pleasure. So it's such a great orientation to health of like towards pleasure versus like chasing away the bad thing, even though we want to get away with that bad thing too. So in these years of study, what have you found to be some of the core things that are important for healthy sexuality and sexual expression?
Well, of course, communication. Yay. And we had to talk about like, oh, we got to talk about sex. But one of the things that I realized is that we don't have a framework to talk about it. So I came up with one. I came up with a framework, and it's called the STARS Talk. And I'll get into this in a minute.
Please.
But the other thing that really I noticed is that we need to understand ourselves, especially people who are raised as women. Like, we're not taught how to own our own sexuality and our own like pleasure and our own for us, right?
Yeah.
And so much of what we're taught about sexuality is like reproductive sex, penetrative sex, heterosexual sex. And if we could step a little bit away from that and relearn what sexuality means, then we're able to talk about it. We're able to ask for it. We're able to keep it alive for us. And so that's what the STARS Talk is. It actually is not only a framework to have conversations, but it's a framework for us to understand to create our sexual self-awareness.
Yeah, it's so important because I think that's one of the biggest things is like where to get started, how to get started. And you're right. Like so many times it's like such a taboo thing to talk about sex. And another thing I hear in so much of my female population is like this sense of like, I'm doing it wrong, right? This feeling of like, because we're not taught that women and men, our processes are different, right? That oftentimes there's this sense of like doing it wrong that I see in my female population. And it's really just like this lack of communication and this lack of understanding and this lack of awareness of like, there's really no right and wrong in this. It's about consent and exploration and communication. And so let's get into your STARS framework. I want to make sure we get, thoroughly into that today. Let's jump in.
Okay. So it's an acronym and each one stands for something. I'll just say what the acronym is really first, and we'll go into each one. So it stands for safety needs, turn-ons, avoids, relationship values or intentions and expectations, and then our sexual health STI disclosure. So it starts out with safety needs because, I've been working on this framework for many years, and I realized like the fundamental thing that we need to know is how to stay safe. Because we cannot open our heart, our mind, or our body if we're not really safe. So then what is safe? What does that even mean, right? And so I like to take that even a step back into like, what does our body tell us? What is the somatic safety? Could we tune into like, oh, when I feel safe, this is how my body is acting. And when I don't feel safe, this is how I'm acting. And like, then you could decide and realize like, oh, I need, like for me personally, I don't feel safe if I'm with somebody and they're drinking a lot of alcohol. Like, I don't feel like I could really have consent in that situation. So one of my safety needs that I tell people is like, I count drinks. If you're going to have more than 2 alcoholic drinks, then, it's going to change our encounter. Some other things that could be safety is like, where do I feel? What location do I feel safest? Do I feel safe getting into a car with somebody I haven't met yet? No. So, let me just tell that to somebody up front so that we could make plans in a way that we could come together so that we're both safe. Like, what do we both need? And it's not something we talk about. It's not even something we think about, but it's so important. So I like to start with safety needs. Safety needs also, like, sometimes the whole sex talk is about safer sex. So we think it's about like condoms and reproductive, but I like to put that to the end. And really start with like, what does our body, our mind, our sex, like what do we need to feel safe with a person? So that's the first one. The second one is turn-ons or things we like. Like, what do I like? One of my turn-ons is I love good conversations. Like that helps me feel safe as well. Like having a good conversation with somebody before I would even consider getting undressed. I know there's people that are really into hookups and that's good. That's what their turn-ons are. That's what they like. So let's bring it out, like how we'd like to be touched. I like to be touched really slowly and softly. So I let my partners know that. So if they're not touching me, softly, I could always say just now a little softer, a little slower, and they don't feel bad about it. I'm just telling them the way that I like. I also love to know what my partners like. How do they like to be held and touched? And and what turns them on. The counter of that is our avoids, what we don't want. And these two could go back and forth, and they're very now they go together, turn-ons and avoids. But our avoids are our boundaries, the things that we don't want, the things that may cause us to go into trauma response. If we're going really deep into that, like, what is my trauma response? How do I look? How do I show up? And can I tell a partner that beforehand so if it happens, they're aware of it? That's a little deeper into the conversation, but I like to bring that up because I think consent has to happen from a trauma-aware, embodied, attuned space. And the STARS talk is a talk. It is a conversation, but it really involves being trauma-aware, embodied, and leaning into learning attunement with one another. So our turn-ons and avoids are really, they could be very powerful for us to actually explain them. And I know when I teach this to a lot of people who are raised as girls and raised as women, a lot of them don't even know what they like. I didn't even know what I liked. It's like, what do I like? I don't know. I'd like to turn my partner on. I'd like to orgasm for this or that. I don't know what I like. I like to make him happy, but really it's about owning ourselves and knowing what do we want and not censoring them, not censoring their orgasm. But, this is how we're going to close the orgasm gap. So those are my turn-ons and avoids. And then there's our relationship expectations and intentions. This is kind of summed up in what does sex mean to me? What do I want in a relationship? What am I looking for with this person? Am I looking for someone distracting? Am I looking for fun? Am I looking for sex? Or am I looking for partnership and love? And knowing that and being clear within ourselves help us navigate this whole dating world, or if we're in a relationship with somebody, to be oh, you know what? I'm feeling like we're doing the domestic thing really good, but I am missing a little bit of that spontaneity and juice. So bringing that to our conversation with our partners. And, when I say expectations, people are oh, we shouldn't have expectations, but it's human to have expectations. So let's own that we have them. And let's say them, and let's just be clear with one another. And then and with part of our expectations, I got this from the sex positive communities, because one of the things that really made such an impact with me is when I kind of learned a little bit about kink and BDSM and how people go into this as a scene. So they create a scene, they actually communicate what they want, what they don't want. And then after they're done, they have aftercare.
Yeah.
And I love that concept. I'm why don't we all have aftercare?
Yes.
Being in a sexual dynamic with somebody or intimate dynamic, it takes energy and I want aftercare. So I'm going to ask what I need, and I'm going to figure out what it is I need, and I want to know what my partner needs. So expectations is kind of that. It's kind of like the aftercare. Do I want to be texted? I don't like it when I text somebody and they don't respond to me, or, in a day. I don't like ghosting. And if I look out for that. Are you somebody who ghosts? Because that's going to be something that's on my no list. That's on my avoid list.
Yes.
So that's a relationship. And then the last death, and I also want to mention that most of the time we start with the R. We don't start, we start with the safety needs in our body. Then we start with the R of what our intentions and expectations and our values are. Then if we're fairly comfortable, we'll go to our turn-ons and avoids. But, the acronym doesn't work in that direction.
Yeah.
We're going to start and we're done. And so then at the very, very end is when we talk about our sexuality and our sexual health and our STI. And sexual health and STIs are two different things, but they're often linked. I want to just, sexual health, especially as we're aging and we have different needs. One of the things that I really talk about a lot is I like lube. Let's normalize using lubricant.
Yeah.
And I think every age, everybody should do that, because it'll really honestly reduce things like bacterial vaginosis if we move away from using saliva as lube and just use lube. And normalizing that, getting hard and getting wet does not mean that you're necessarily turned off or on. Our bodies don't always respond the way that our brains do.
Genital non-concordance.
Exactly. So let's normalize those conversations. And then STIs. And STIs are one of these conversations that are really close to my heart, because our difficulty discussing sexually transmitted infections really has to do more with our difficulty accepting sexuality than it does with the actual infections. I mean, I like to say how many people died from COVID since COVID happened in the United States, and it's over 1 million. How many people have died from genital herpes? Like, no one. Yeah. So I'm like, why is it so much more stigmatized to say we have genital herpes and it doesn't say we have COVID? It's because one is linked to sex and one isn't. One affects our genitals, and that's like, oh my gosh, those private places we don't want to go to. So I really think that if we're able to just bring this out into the lights, get it out of the shadows, and be able to actually get tested, communicate our results, we will destigmatize not just STIs, but sexuality in general. So there, you got
I love it. And the follow-up questions, because I think it's like such a beautiful framework, because I know so many times it can be difficult to have these conversations from a standpoint of like, okay, great, I'm supposed to talk and communicate about sex, but like, what do I even say, right? So like, I think your framework really breaks it down to say, okay, well, let's make sure in these conversations we have all of these bases covered, that all of these bases will really help with deepening the connection, deepening the care, deepening the sexual experience, whether it is a short-term partner or a long-term partner, regardless of any of that. But then in my mind, when I hear this, like one of the next things that comes up that I imagine our listeners are wondering is like, okay, but how do I even like initiate the conversation, right? So it's like, okay, listen to this episode. Like now I have like all these things I need to talk about, but oh gosh, my partner is either new and we've never had this and this feels scary, or my partner's long term and we've never had this and this feels scary, or I know they're stressed out or I'm stressed out, and all the other components that go into sexuality of all the other, say, outside noise in life. So where does somebody even begin to, say, implement your framework? So like taking a step back.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we're doing something new and different, it's uncomfortable. The first time we get naked with somebody, it's awkward, right? So like, it's part of it is just inviting the awkward, being okay with the awkward and making a step to make change. How do you initiate it? Like personally, I just say, hey, do you want to do a Stars Talk? I just heard this thing. It's called Stars Talk. Do you want to try it out? If you go to my website, Make Time for the Talk, there's the acronym. You could find it on there. There's a workbook that's a little bit too detailed, but you could still get that. That's free. And you could just bring it up like, hey, I just heard this thing. Do you want to try it out? Or sometimes I do it like on a first date. I'll do it as a game, like a game. Hey, I have this game I want to play. Want to play the Stars Talk? And I'll go through mine and then I listen to theirs. And I never had anybody say, oh, that feels weird, or like, no. Because if you present it as a fun thing to do and a connection thing to do, it makes it a lot easier. And you may not have all the answers. And it's something that grows. Another way of doing it is I also have a document, like a Word doc, that I have my Stars Talk on. And then if I feel like, ooh, I'm heading in that direction, sometimes I'll take the things that I want to share with the person and I'll just email it to them, or I'll share them my Stars Talk. And you don't even have to do it in one sitting. Like you could just have it in the back of your head, like, oh, these are the things that I really need to talk about. And in a normal conversation, you'll be like, hey, these are like my intentions, or this is what I hope for, this is what I like. Like you just make sure that you cover each one of those bases. And then later on, you could be like, hey, this is called the Stars Talk. The Stars Talk, I really believe, could fundamentally change the way we date and have relationships. But it's a grassroots movement. It's something that, like, I want everybody to do this. I'm not getting rich off of this. I'm not being famous off of this. I want somebody to do it. So it's just going to take people who are listening to try it out and just take that little step, and then teach their friends and teach their kids and, have the ripple effect from it.
Another thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking that I love, one of my core values is efficiency. So I'm always like figuring out like, okay, well, how can we take this and be even more efficient with our results and play and all the things? And one of the ways that I even see this being used is even a way of helping with flirting, right? Because so many times I find that like that couples kind of forget how to flirt. or if somebody is single after a long-term relationship and they're going back into being single, then it can be like, oh my gosh, this feels so awkward. I haven't like flirted or dated in so long. But I see this as like an avenue to like even have this conversation, and, everything's positive. And afterwards, sending that like flirtatious text of like, wow, I was really turned on when you said this, or those kind of things. So I think it also gives this like almost this like this material that one can create for, yes, that greater communication and greater intimacy emotionally and sexually, but also this amazing opportunity to flirt, to play, and to really, really build on it from there. Have you seen that in your work?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. It could be incredibly painful. I mean, like, who doesn't like to talk about what turns them on or listen to something turns them on? Like, to me, people are like, oh my gosh, that's going to be so hard to say that. Like, there's nothing hotter than hearing what turns somebody on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fun. Like, people, I think it's like so taboo, but people are dying to have this conversation. I've noticed this when I'm snowboarding and like on a chairlift and somebody asks me what I do and I say I'm the libido doc. The amount of like information that just like readily pours out of their mouth, like not even in like a HIPAA compliant medical situation where they don't really know who I am, but they're just like, I think people are just dying for the opportunity to talk about it. So that's where I think your framework is just so, so, so huge. I know we don't have much more time left today, but I want to make sure that we get if you have any itching things around like, oh, we got to say this today. This is super important. Do you have anything that we like left out that you want to make sure we absolutely get to say today?
Just that the most important person to do a stars talk with is yourself. And really is yourself. And we're just, we're raised in a culture that really does not elevate the beauty and the importance of our sexuality for our health and for our heart. And so this work is not because I want everybody to be hooking up and having great sex. It's because I want everybody to feel like they're sexually empowered.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, sex does not die after you turn 50.
Yeah.
In fact, I am in my 50s. I'm in my late 50s. And I have the best sex that I've ever had in my entire life. So I'd like to leave people with that hope.
I love that so much. I have studied a little bit of Richard Bandler's work with NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. I was listening to a talk once of his, and I just loved this talk so much because he was said in this talk, he's like, and I'm going to misquote this, but it was something to the lines of how strange he thought it was when everybody was getting married and everybody was like, oh, after married, the sex goes down, enjoy it now. And his response was like, are you telling me that I'm going to practice something over and over and over and over again, and I'm going to keep doing this, I'm going to practice this more, and I'm going to get worse at it? And it was like such a great, frame of like, reframe on exactly what you're saying around like, there's all these things around like, okay, sex has to die in long-term relationships. Sex gets, dies after a certain age. And of course it can, like anything else, if we don't put time, effort, and energy into it, but it can also be 100% the opposite. So thank you for being another example of living proof of exactly that.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you and chat with you. And we're going to put information on how to get a hold of you in the show notes. So we'll have your maketimeforthetalk.com website, other ways of getting a hold of you. Is there anything else you want to mention about just working with you or anything like that in our time together?
Yeah, I do. I'm also a menopause doctor and do a lot of work around women and transitions. And so I love working with women. I love working with women through transitions and sexuality and keeping your life yummy.
Perfect. I love the word yummy too. So all of that information on working with Dr. Dack will be in the show notes, everybody. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank all of our listeners for another great episode. Remember, everybody, in 2024, what we're doing is when you download, rate, review, share these podcasts, whoever has the most downloads, the highest ratings, the most shares, all of that good stuff, we're inviting them back at the end of the year for a super duper deep dive. And I know I would love to continue this conversation. I know you would too. So please do share this episode. Please do download it. It helps get these reviews up so we can invite Dr. Dacker back. This is Dr. Diane signing off, reminding you to always stay sexy, always be classy, and always stay a little badassy. See you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Libido Lounge. Please don't keep me a secret. Please share this with your friends. You can find me on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as how to work with me at mylibidodoc.com.